Good evening and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Suddhāso, and this evening we'll be looking at another discourse of the Buddha. So I'll start with paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll read through the discourse and give some explanations, and then take questions at the end. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sammasambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sammasambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sammasambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So this evening we'll be looking at another discourse from the Anguttara Nikaya. This is from chapter 5, sutta number 215, which is titled here as the Patama Akkhantiya Sutta. This is the first of two discourses with a similar title. So the Akkhanti or Akkhantiya Sutta means not to have khanti. This requires then to explain the word khanti. So there's a few meanings to this word. It's commonly translated simply as patience, which is one meaning of it. Khanti also has the meaning of tolerance. It also has the meaning of acceptance. It also has the meaning of forgiveness. It also has the meaning of endurance. It also has the meaning of approval. So this word has actually quite a range of meanings depending upon the context. But usually the most common usages of the word khanti are to mean either patience or tolerance. But it's good to be aware that it does have these other shades of meaning, because it gives a little more depth to what the Buddha is talking about. So this is a very short discourse, so I'll read through it and give some explanation. The Buddha says, "Monks, there are these 5 drawbacks of intolerance." So intolerance is how the translator here is translating akkhanti. So lack of khanti, he's translating as intolerance. But keeping in mind that can also mean impatience. So these are the 5 drawbacks of impatience. Or lack of endurance, or also of being unforgiving. 5 drawbacks of being intolerant, impatient, and unforgiving. So those are the 3 main usages of this word which seem relevant in this context. He says, what 5? So the first one, most people find you unlikable and unlovable. One of the residents here is laughing a bit at this. But actually, I really appreciate how straightforward and clear the Buddha is at times. He's often appealing directly to the common desires of people. Most people want to be liked. They enjoy it when other people like them and approve of them. So if you want to be liked by other people, well, being intolerant, impatient, and unforgiving is a pretty good way to be disliked by lots of people. Just asking yourself, do I like to be around people who are impatient, intolerant, and unforgiving? Not really. It's not something that we like. And the second one, it says the second drawback of a lack of khanti, so a lack of patience, tolerance, and forgiveness. So he says you have lots of aversion and many faults. So vera bahulo, vajja bahulo. So vera means hostility or aversion, tendency towards arguments, so argumentative or combative. And vajja bahulo, vajja has the meaning of fault, something which is blameworthy, some defect. So vajja literally means that which can be criticized, from the word vad, which means to speak to. So vajja is something that other people would criticize you for. So vera bahulo, so you have a lot of hostility, of aversion, You're subject to arguments and combative encounters. And Vajrabahulo, you have lots of defects and faults. So you're very blameworthy. You're subject to criticism. So again, Vajra literally means subject to criticism. And again, most people don't like to be criticized. So being the target of criticism is a drawback. If one is intolerant, impatient, and unforgiving, then one will more likely be the target of criticism. The next one, he says, you die confused. Sammulho kalang karoti. This is one of the phrases that the Buddha uses many times in the suttas, which I find really delightful. So he talks about unawakened people who are full of defilements, and he says that they die confused. Which, again, if you think about it, it's for many people, the moment of death is something which is something they're really afraid of. And then when the moment of death comes, the mind becomes full of confusion. And why is the mind confused as death comes? Well, because the mind has developed very strong habits of greed, hatred, and delusion. And with the onset of death, then the mind starts to lose its clarity and its self-restraint. So it reverts to those animalistic impulses, those animalistic drives. And those animalistic drives are based upon our defilements, based upon greed, hatred, delusion, and fear. So the mind then falls into a state of confusion and turmoil. And there's also the disturbance of knowing, like if we've cultivated a lot of unwholesome behaviors in our life, we've built up a lot of bad karma, then there might also be fear around death, and that we don't know where we're going. We don't know whether we're going to be reborn in good conditions or bad conditions. Whereas somebody who has cultivated a lot of good karma in their life, when they approach the moment of death, they tend to do so with joy and serenity because they know that it can only lead to a good rebirth. They know they've cultivated the conditions for a good rebirth, and they have nothing to fear in death. And then the last one, he says, and when one is separated from one's body after death, one is reborn in a place of deprivation, a bad destination, in the underworld, in hell. So in Pali, that's apayang dugating vinipatang nirayang. So these are apayang, a state of deprivation, of loss. So this could mean as simple as being born as a human in really terrible conditions, where you don't have access to your basic needs. Dugating is, again, a bad destination. So again, that could mean just being born as a human with really awful conditions. But usually apayang and dugating in the suttas, these are taken to mean to rebirth below the level of a human. So rebirth in the lower realms. And the last two ones, vinipata. Vinipata literally means downfall. So the translator here rendered it as underworld, which is cute. But vinipata comes from the verb patati, which means to fall, and ni, which means down. So and then vi is this intensifier prefix. So can also mean away or separated from. So vinipata means to fall down and away. So downfall, a state of downfall. And vinipata is used to refer to the hell realms. So the worst domains in samsara. And also the word nirya. Similarly, the word nirya means going down. So the verb aya, which means to go, no relationship to the title, which means venerable, by the way. But ayati means to move or to go. And nir means down. So niraya means going down. So it's referring to the lowest realms in the planes of existence. The lowest realms being the hell realm, states of extreme suffering and torment. So if you think you have it bad as a human, it's nothing compared to the hell realms. The hell realms are unspeakably miserable. Fortunately, they're temporary. So these are the 5 drawbacks of lacking khanti, of lacking patience and tolerance, of not being forgiving of others, not being accepting of others, and of lacking endurance. So being too quick to give up, too quick to give in, especially too quick to give in to our defilements. And so then the flip side is the Buddha talks about the 5 benefits of khanti. Now, what are the 5 benefits of having khanti? So having patience, endurance, tolerance, forgiveness, acceptance. So cultivating these wholesome qualities, these wholesome attitudes. And it's good to notice, by the way, that khanti is referring both to one's own internal experience, so being patient with one's own internal experience. For example, during meditation practice. A lot of meditation practice is just about patience. Patiently staying with it as this endless stream of horrific noise floods through the mind, and you're just like, well, okay, I'm just going to patiently endure this. And eventually, this flood of noise will start drying up. And it does eventually. Or being patient with the sensations of your body. It's like, okay, my body hurts, it aches. I really am not enjoying doing all this sitting meditation. But if I'm patient and I endure, then gradually my aversion towards these sensations will start fading away. And the mind will become increasingly happy and joyful. So this is khanti directed inwardly. So it's the sense of patience and endurance of our sensations and our experiences. But it also has an outward sense of how we relate to other people. Again, at a bare minimum, it means being patient with other people, tolerant of other people, accepting of other people. And this means tolerating the things they do, which we maybe don't like so much. And also means accepting that they are the way they are. Often we want to try to change other people, but it's nearly impossible to change other people. Unless they want to change, there's really not much we can do. So what we can do is to practice patience, tolerance, and acceptance. And when other people do commit faults and errors, then we forgive them, recognizing that it's normal behavior of unawakened people to do unawakened things. And that holding on to resentment towards them is futile. In fact, it's just a way of damaging ourselves. And also being forgiving with ourselves. So recognizing that we also are unawakened beings, subject to doing unawakened things, which means that we're not going to be perfect all the time. In fact, most of our Buddhist life is going to be a series of errors and mistakes, a series of shortcomings. So also having khanti with ourselves, having forgiveness for ourselves, patience and acceptance and tolerance towards our own faults as we cultivate the path towards awakening. So the Buddha says, these are the 5 benefits of khanti. So tolerance, patience, forgiveness, endurance, acceptance. It says, what 5? First one, most people find you dear and lovable. Oh, how lovely. Just think about how lovely it is to be around someone who's patient and tolerant and forgiving. It's really nice to be around people like that. The kind of person who isn't quick and snappy and resentful, but someone who's patient and kind and forgiving of your little mistakes. It's really nice. The next one, you have little hostility. So this word vera, which I was talking about earlier. So when one is cultivating khanti, then one doesn't have this combative, argumentative mind. One doesn't have this mind like a battleground. One's mind becomes peaceful and serene, which is the opposite of vera. And also one doesn't have much which can be criticized. So one doesn't have a lot of vajja. So vajja, again, is things which can be criticized, grounds for criticism. So when we're very patient and kind and tolerant of others, then they'll have a hard time finding things to criticize us about, to blame us for. And also when we look at our own mind, we'll see there's fewer defects, fewer flaws. And next, he says, one will not be confused when one dies. So instead of dying confused, you will die unconfused. So this also is good news. If you're cultivating khanti during your life, then as the moment of death approaches, then your mind will be more serene, more peaceful, more clear. It will not fall into a state of confusion and desperation as death comes. So you can die with a clear and peaceful mind. And finally, of course, he says, and when one is separated from one's body after death, then one will be reborn in a good destination, in a heavenly world. So also pointing again to the fact that as we build up good karma in our life through the practice of patience, of forgiveness, of acceptance, endurance, tolerance, then we're creating the good karma that leads to being reborn as a deva, leads to being reborn in the most pleasant and peaceful zones of samsara. And that's, of course, assuming that we don't attain full awakening. Because the cultivation of khanti also is a critical element of the path of awakening. It's a critical aspect of how we train the mind in order to abandon all defilements and to achieve the perfect purity of complete awakening, which of course is the highest benefit. So it's not specifically mentioned in the sutta, but it's something which is laid out throughout the rest of the suttas. How cultivating khanti is a critical element of the path to awakening. As we find, for example, in the often quoted Dhammapada verse where the Buddha says, khanti paramang tapotiteka. So khanti, he says, is the highest form of spiritual practice. So it's the critical linchpin that brings together all the other pieces of the path. So those are a few words on this sutta, another short, sweet discourse by the Buddha. So we can respect the sutta with 3 sadhus, and then I'll take any questions. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And hello to all the people joining in online. So hello to Gold Days, Marielle, BC, Lydia, Bhumika, Vivian, Meredith, Mir, Yankee, Richard, Karuna, Manol, Mary, Random Ramblings, Ming Ming, Maria, Jay, Aparna, John, Kumu, and Amaranta, and Julie. Welcome to all of you. And I see some questions here. So first question is from John. So John says, what is the meaning of khanti? I think I explained it sufficiently clearly. And he continues, what are its signs when present? So look at your own mind. Look at your mind and see, is the mind patient? Is the mind tolerant? Is the mind accepting? So khanti is very closely related to upekkha, equanimity. So when the mind has a strong equanimity, then it's not bothered by things. It's patient, it's tolerant. And it's also the opposite of resentment. So khanti, when the mind has khanti, then there's no resentment. So notice what the mind feels like when it's holding on to a grudge, and let go of that grudge. And you'll get a sense of khanti. So khanti is when you let go of your grudges. You accept that the people around you and yourself as well are prone to defects just because we're not enlightened yet. As I was talking about in the sutta yesterday, pretty much everybody in the world is mentally ill. Only fully awakened beings are not mentally ill. Everybody else is mentally ill. So then when you see some not so great behavior in someone, you can reflect, oh, this person's mentally ill. They're just expressing their mental illness. Oh, how sad for them. May they become well. May they overcome this difficulty. And also with yourself, when you see some not so great behavior in yourself, you can be like, oh, I'm displaying signs of my own mental illness. May I overcome this illness? May I become free of this mental illness? John says, is it something that arises momentarily, or is it a more continuous presence in the mind stream? That sounds like a uselessly academic question to me, to be perfectly honest. So the question is it present right now? Everything arises momentarily. So look at what's arising right now. That's what's important. And if you want to get all academic and philosophical about it, then we can say that the appearance of continuous presence is a sequence of momentary arisings. That's been a standard way of talking about things in Buddhism for millennia. But it's just a way of talking. The important thing is the mind in a state of khanti? Do you have khanti present? If not, then build it up. And John says, does a lot of fear show lack of khanti as well? Yes. Yes, because when the mind is in a state of fear, then it is not patient, it's not accepting, and it's not tolerant. So yes, in the many places in the suttas, the Buddha speaks about fear as being a symptom of defilements. And an awakened mind has no fear. So whenever fear is present, you can stop and check. What is the underlying defilement? It's usually some form of aversion. Sometimes shades of desire, and always mixed in with a heavy dose of delusion. And John says, how to fix that? I've been working on my fear and I've had some success. That's great. It's great that you've had some success. So the main way you deal with fear actually is through mindfulness, equanimity, and above all else, metta. The more you practice metta, loving kindness, the less fear you'll have. And also confidence in your own spiritual growth. That also tends to counteract fear. And Buddha also recommended to recollect Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha as a counter to fear. But the critical thing, again, is to practice mindfulness and equanimity, practice loving kindness, and to build up confidence in your spiritual practice, confidence that you're moving towards awakening. And all of that will tend to diminish fear, so that fear comes up less frequently and less intensely. And John says, how do we know when to be patient with others or when to put our foot down and say no? When it becomes a source of unwholesome behaviors. So if somebody else is behaving in a genuinely unwholesome way, then sometimes we actually need to say no for their benefit in order to help them stop doing unwholesome things. Or if interacting with somebody else is inspiring unwholesome behaviors in ourselves, then we need to tell ourselves no and remove ourselves from that situation, at least for the time being. So when it leads to more unwholesome behavior, then that's a sign that we need to make changes. And Randall says, does being patient lead to attract abusive behavior from people that interpret tolerance as weakness? Yeah, it can. You should avoid those sorts of people. Those are the sorts of people that we tolerate from as much distance as possible. So practicing khanti does not mean that you need to willingly put yourself in the presence of dangerous people or harmful people. You should also be practicing loving kindness for yourself, which means not putting yourself in those kinds of situations. So yeah, I recommend avoiding those sorts of people. And again, practicing khanti does not mean making yourself a doormat. It doesn't mean opening yourself to abuse from other people. Often the kindest thing you can do to an abusive person is to avoid them. So that they start to, at a bare minimum, so they don't have a target to practice their unwholesome karma with. And ideally, they'll start to realize that people are drifting away from them and all the good people are disappearing from their life. And that might give them a hint that there's something wrong with their behavior. But you are not obligated to be their doormat. You're not obligated to be their punching bag. And BC says, can you comment on being patient, loving, and tolerant while at the same time avoiding unwholesome behaviors from others? I think this is when practicing non-attachment is beneficial. Non-attachment is always beneficial, given that that's Buddhism. Buddhism is non-attachment. So being patient, loving, and tolerant while avoiding unwholesome behavior from others. Yeah, so again, it's an evaluation of the situation. So these things are always situational. So when we're in a situation, then we're patient, loving, and tolerant. But if we recognize that the situation is just getting worse and not better, then ideally we should either change the situation or remove ourselves from the situation. Again, we're not obligated to stay in a place or stay with a person if things are just getting worse. That's not practicing khanti, that's just practicing foolishness. And Julie says, when we begin seeing anger arise and see it disappear without reacting, is this the beginning of mindfulness, of a change in habit? Yes, that can be a good sign. Usually before making progress, instead we just get angry and we express our anger. And then we realize, oh, that wasn't so great. But as we develop in our practice, then you'll start to recognize the anger arising. And then you'll have an opportunity to not express it. And then it will start fading away. And eventually that will lead to the point where the anger arises less frequently and less intensely. And eventually it can lead to anger not arising at all. So yes, this can be a step in the right direction. Mariel says, does it mean that those who are actually diagnosed with a mental illness might be in a deeper delusion than the rest? So I try to avoid talking about modern psychology because I don't know enough about the topic to say anything educated and informed. So I actually recommend directing questions like this to Bhante Suddhāso, who actually is both a fully trained Buddhist monk and a fully trained Western psychologist. So he's the one who can answer these sorts of questions. So better than me giving a brief, glib answer on these things. Because actually, I think a lot of people who are considered so-called normal by modern standards are extremely delusional by Buddhist standpoint. So just because somebody is diagnosed with a mental illness doesn't necessarily mean their delusion is worse than other people. And just because somebody else is not diagnosable does not mean that they're less delusional than everybody else. Actually, honestly, I think the kind of person who thinks that happiness is found through food, sex, money, and entertainment, I think that kind of person is extremely delusional. But in terms of normal society, that kind of person would be considered normal. In fact, possibly well-adapted member of society. But from a Buddhist standpoint, they're extremely delusional. And Karuna says, the sutta is saying rebirth in hell is a possible outcome of taking egregious action with impatience, right? Not just having impatient thoughts, like if you were impatient at the store. So I think being impatient at the store is not sufficiently strong to be reborn in hell. So yes, I think the Buddha is talking about more extreme actions based upon intolerance and impatience. I don't think he's just talking about like being at the store and being like, this line is really long. Is it going to speed up? And boom, born in hell. Like I think it's a bit more than that. And also it's about a pattern of behavior, a cumulative effect of a habit of impatience and intolerance. And again, he's also talking not just about being kind of like, come on, can we speed this up? But he's also talking about how we interact and relate to other people. So a habit of being unforgiving and harsh and intolerant towards other people. Okay, and that's the last question online. Anything from the residents here on this topic? You have a question?
Yeah. So you mentioned that Vera means something like negative. I think that's what I remember.
Hostile or combative? is more accurate. Negative is a little bit too bland.
Okay. But like when we take the five precepts, you know, like the part where it says Adinadaviramani.
So that's actually a different word. So Vairamani means abstaining from or avoiding. So I don't think the words are related, but they might be. I would have to look it up. So that comes, again, it's a verb that means to avoid or abstain from. So avoiding killing, avoiding stealing, avoiding sexual misconduct, and so on. So it's not the same word. So where you've probably seen this is in metta chants, like Ahang Sukito Homi, Avero Homi, Avero Homi. May I not have Vera. May I have a mind which is not hostile, not combative. That's what it's talking about. Yeah. There's another question here online. So Suzanne says, when a person is not being unwholesome, however, they're not following suggested policies of a silent retreat. A person sitting next to me was doing continuous audible inhaling and aversion, hearing, etc., etc. Your reflections. My suggestion is to practice tolerance and patience. That's actually an ideal moment when you're meditating and the person next to you is breathing loudly. Practice patience and tolerance. If you think the person is just deliberately disrupting the retreat for other people, then report it to the retreat manager. But your practice is to be patient and kind and tolerant. Possibly do metta for that person. Just wishing for them to be happy really makes a big difference. And Manal says, would you speak more about impatience with one's meditation practice and how this can be helped? I notice great hesitation before I actually commit to sit. Yeah, I mean, the main way you get through it is just by doing it. Just do it. And one thing which really helps tremendously with patience and meditation in particular, by the way, is to just completely forget about time. Ideally, when you're sitting in meditation, there should be no clock visible. So set a timer to go off when the meditation is over and have no clock within your eyesight. And just act like time does not exist. The meditation period never began and it will never end. All you have is this moment right now, this one eternal moment. And this one eternal, joyful, peaceful moment. How delightful. So try to cultivate that kind of attitude, that attitude of timelessness, eternal timelessness. Then the impatience can only happen when you're thinking about the future. If you're not thinking about the future, the mind cannot be impatient. And Scott says, was there a shift in your practice pertaining to aversion? Yes, cultivating metta. The biggest change for me was there was a day many years ago when I decided that I was going to do at least 5 minutes of metta meditation every day. And I resolved that the first period of meditation, the first 5 minutes would be metta every day. And it made a huge difference. So there's a strong connection between metta and khanti. So the more you practice metta, the easier it is to practice khanti. Suzanne says, I was doing continuous noting of aversion, hearing, etc., your reflections. Yeah, that sounds like a really bad plan. Do metta. Just sitting there like, aversion, aversion, I really hate this person, aversion, aversion, yeah, this person sucks, aversion, aversion, I hope they die, aversion, 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 hearing, hearing, hearing something really annoying. Like, of course it's not going to solve the problem. No, cultivate metta. Much better. Practice metta. Yeah, one of the problems with noting practice is it very easily reifies the mental problems, makes them stronger, reinforces them, rather than removing them. And Sud says, what if impatience is there in the mind and one just sees it arise and pass away with mindfulness awareness? Then will this impatience still have an effect on the mind, or did we negate its effect entirely? So you're talking about being patient with impatience. That's great. Bonus points. Yeah, that will negate it. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, it's actually interesting. When you start patiently observing impatience, then you start to see that, like everything else, it's just a temporary, impermanent mental object. It's just another impermanent sankhara. Not me, not mine, not who I am. Doesn't need to have any effect on our experience. It's very interesting to be patient with impatience. So Amaranta says, I usually have tolerance, but this has caused problems to me because I endure too much and I end up being more ill. What do you recommend? I recommend being practical. So when it comes to matters of physical health, be practical. This is something which comes through very clearly in the Vinaya. The Buddha was very practical when it came to matters of health. About half of the Vinaya rules have exceptions for illness. And the exceptions for medicines are so broad and extensive that you can justify almost anything under medicine. So the Buddha was very practical when it came to physical health matters. So I recommend also being very practical when it comes to your physical health. So be patient with the painful sensations, but also be realistic about taking care of your body appropriately. And that's the last question online. You have a question? Go ahead.
Going back to metta practice, I've noticed I have an attitude of impatience connected with an expecting of the results of metta practice. Like, people often say, oh, metta will brighten the mind so much. And having that expectation often it's like can kind of have the backfire in what it will generate, like impatience. So, oh, where's the bright mind? It hasn't arisen yet. So I wonder if you could speak on that.
Yeah, so don't expect results.
Right.
So this is actually why actually you were asking earlier about the Zen tradition. So in the Zen tradition, they talk about not wanting to become a Buddha. So it's exactly that. Like you just do your practice for the sake of doing your practice. So it's the same with metta. Like you don't do it for the sake of getting some result in the future. You just do metta because this is part of Dhamma practice. And you just wholeheartedly focus on just doing metta. Building up that feeling of metta in the heart. Just focus on that. And the results will come on their own. You don't need to worry about that. But they'll come in their own time. So you just need to focus on just doing metta. And also accept that results may not come when you want them to or how you want them to. Your focus is just on creating the causes and conditions for awakening. And one of them is cultivating metta. Okay. Okay, and that looks like the last question. So we'll go ahead and conclude the session at this time with 3 more sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you all next time.